Thank you very much for your kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present, well, some first impressions of a first reading of some articles in Castro's Adversus Omnis Haeresis. And these articles all deal with a problem, or with the key theological problems of the time, the arising difference, denominational difference between Catholics and Protestants. So if we take, I think I have some problems, sorry, with the present, or with the PDF file. I hope it works all fine. If you read through Adversus Omnis Haeresis, the polemical and logical sharpness of Castro's text suggests a profound acquaintance of Castro with the works of and the theological thought of Martin Luther and other Protestants. Castro frequently emphasized his intellectual rigor. Already in the preface to the first edition of Adversus Omnis Haeresis, Castro underlined that, quote, listing these heresies required me to unroll the works of countless authors and examine a vast number of volumes, unquote. And indeed, throughout his text, Castro made his sources transparent. Sometimes he just adds something like ut Lutherus ait or alike. In a few rare cases, he also takes for sure what other people told him, but most of the time Castro provided the reader with a title or even with a concrete hint to a certain chapter in a certain book. All these observations generate the impression of an extremely well-informed specialist whose knowledge of Protestant theology and the leading German reformers derived from hundreds of books and from conversations with other Catholics from all over Europe. However, a closer look to Castro's references reveals a much more complex portrait of Castro. Therefore, the purpose of my paper is to find out what the exact sources were that Castro used. What did he actually read? How precise was Castro's image of Lutheranism? And how did this affect the way he constructed heresy? Broadly speaking, Castro relied on two types of sources. The first, books of the heretics, and the second, books of other defenders of orthodoxy, of Catholic theologians. When it comes to the books of Catholic writers, Castro's citations are remarkably precise. Apart from individual references in the articles of his catalogue, Castro provided the readers with hints on where to find further information at the end of many chapters in this catalogue of heresies. He even updated this information with every revision of his book. At the end of the chapter on Gratia, for example, Castro listed Augustine's De Fide Epopebus alongside the Dominican friar Jacob von Hoogstraten and the Flemish theologian José van Cliftonhoeve. When Castro revised the text after the Council of Trent, he added the names of Cardinal Cajetan and the Italian Dominican Ambrosius Catharinus Politus, both of whom he had met at the Council of Trent. In the last revision, he also inserted Albert Piguet as yet another contemporary whose works were an important point of reference during the debates in Trent. A similar combination of contemporary authorities can be found in other articles as well throughout his book. In the dedication to De Justitia Haereticorum Punitione, dated October 1547 in Salamanca, Castro even gives us an extensive list of contemporary authors that he referred to as Orthodox authorities. Introducing Catholic learned men from all over the Christian world, Castro listed names of theologians ex omni natione, beginning with the Germans, namely Johannes Eck, who famously attacked Luther at the Leipzig debate in summer of 1519, and who later on wrote various polemical books against Luther. Johann Fabri, another productive controversialist who later became Bishop of Vienna. Kaspar Schatzgeier, the superior of the Strasbourg province of the Friars Minor, whose books in defense of the Holy Mass had a great impact. And Johannes Koch-Leuss, a humanist and theologian famous for his aggressive polemics against Luther. Among the names that follow, we find the previously mentioned Jacob von Hoogstraten and Joseph van Cliftonhoeve, as well as Albert Pigge and Ambrosius Catharinus. The list closes with 3 Spaniards, the famous Dominican Domingo de Soto, and his Franciscan colleague Andrés de Vega, who were together with Castro at the Council of Trent by order of the Emperor. Interestingly, in this list, Castro employs an antithetical inclusio by opening the list with Johannes Eck as the primus omnium vir loquissimus and concluding it with himself as the historum omnium minimus. With this rhetorical framing, he paid homage to the famous contemporaries, while strategically positioning himself as the final and definitive voice of orthodoxy. Now that we have the first idea of the orthodox authorities Castro referred to, a brief glance at the 5-page Index Haereticorum Omnium at the very beginning of Adversus Omnes Haeresis might suggest that he had read through hundreds of heretical works. The impression is reinforced by the previously cited claim that he had to unroll the works of countless authors and examine a vast number of works. However, the actual number of Protestants on this index is surprisingly small. In the first edition, the longest entry belongs, of course, to Martin Luther, whom Castro considered the worst heretic of all times. He is followed by the Waldensians and John Wycliffe, who, in Castro's view, had already revived some of the most pernicious heresies before Luther. The remaining 4 entries referring to Protestants are no longer than a single line each, with the exception of Johannes Lampard, whose entry comprises 4 lines. In the final edition of Adversus Omnes Haeresis, we find 8 more names of Protestants that have been added to the index, and the entry for Philipp Melanchthon now extended 7 lines. This shows that Castro constantly revised and improved his catalog and also his sources throughout the years. Both in timing and substance, these revisions are intimately connected to the debates of the first period of the Council of Trent, which Castro attended by order of the Emperor as a theological advisor in the entourage of the Spanish Cardinal Francisco Pacheco. As research on the Council of Trent has shown, it actually lacked Lutheran books. Although Johann Fabri had suggested to provide the Council with 10 copies of each Lutheran book as early as 1537, and despite the claims of Cardinal Pole and others that Lutheran doctrine should be thoroughly analyzed before taking any decision at the Council, the Pope and the Curia were unwilling to invest the money and the effort required to collect and purchase the hundreds of titles Fabri had compiled. At the opening of the Council in 1545, the only informations the bishops had regarding Lutheran doctrine came mainly from anti-Lutheran compendia, written by authors we have seen in Castro's list, as well as from the list of errors in the Bull Ex Urge Domine by Pope Leo, who was actually drafted primarily by Johannes Eck. After 1 year had passed, Pacheco once again attempted to convince the fathers at the Council that thorough analysis of Lutheran theology was indispensable in order to isolate their errors and condemn them. However, Pacheco's proposal went unheeded. So the Council continued to discuss Lutheran errors regarding justification based mainly on compendia of errors compiled by Catholic controversialists. It was only towards the end of the first period of the Council that an increasing number of fathers shifted to Pacheco's position. Even though the first edition of Adversus Omnes Haeresis had been published already in 1534, Castro himself also felt the lack of first-hand knowledge regarding Lutheran teachings. In a long passage that he inserted after the Council of Trent concerning the doctrine of the assurance of salvation within the article on gratia, he openly admitted that when he published the first edition in 1534, he, quote, had not seen the work of Luther in which he had written his doctrine. Only at the Council of Trent, quote, I had the chance to read the books of Luther and of all his followers, unquote. This opportunity was provided by the Emperor's ambassador, Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, who, as Castro notes, prepared a copious library equipped with all the books of the Lutherans, so that as many as wished could examine them in order to combat their doctrines during the Council of Trent. Unfortunately, the exact contents of Mendoza's library are unknown. After his death, the library was transferred to El Escorial, where its original inventory burned at the Escorial fire of 1671. The reconstruction of the catalogue by Anthony Hobson in 1999 shows that later catalogues were either incomplete or subject to censorship, as were the books of Mendoza themselves. Due to further losses, the reconstructed catalogue only comprises around 1,000 titles, among them many books of Catholic controversialists like Eck and Corleus, but not a single Protestant book. Therefore, to find out what Castro actually read at the council, we need to go back to the analysis of Castro's text. To illustrate the growth of Castro's knowledge, I have highlighted on this slide all the passages that he added to the Lemma Gratia over the years. As you can see, during the Council of Trent, he only made 2 small additions in blue, these 2 small blue lines. But in the following years after the Council, the article grew more than 4 times longer. This is because, apart from minor changes, Castro added a 30-page long refutation of Luther's heretical teachings about the assurance of salvation as a third heresy to the Lemma Gratia. Similar extensions can be found in many other articles, even though they are not always that long. I tried to calculate a top 10 list of extended articles. I put the additions that I used in the left column of the slide. The numbers here are not very precise because I only count the pages, not the lines or words. But the slide gives at least a first impression which lemmata Castro modified the first. And as you can see by the gray highlighting, the articles Castro extended the most mainly dealt with justification, which is no surprise given his presence in Trent during the debates about these particular topics. Furthermore, Castro also added 16 new articles, and again, Catholicudo and Fiducia belonged to the subject area of justification and were added after the Council of Trent. To sum up, it is evident that Castro augmented his text significantly with every revision, and that this is all in the context, or has to be seen in the context of the Council of Trent, and that Mendoza's library gave him the opportunity to read more Lutheran books than before. However, did this development actually affected Castro's perspective on Lutheranism? To give an answer, let me show you 3 examples for quotations in Castro's text. A first example, in the 1549 revision, Castro added some verba Lutheri to the second heresy of the article on Gratia, mentioning explicitly that he did not quote Luther directly, but used a Catalogus Erodum by Johannes Eck. A word-by-word comparison with Eck's original texts show that Castro indeed quoted him verbatim. However, Eck's wording cannot be found anywhere in Luther's works. In reality, Eck provided a drastically shortened and misleading synthesis of a longer passage on faith in De Captivitate Babylonica. Eck's synthesis is misleading precisely because he cherry-picked these phrases, isolating them from a broader argument, and this made the gap between Luther and the tradition, or that the theology that Castro considered as Catholic tradition, to appear even wider. The very same misleading summary can, by the way, be found in the Opusculum de Justificatione by Andrés de Vega. In addition to Castro, Vega provided the reader with the information that the supposed first-hand quotation was taken from De Captivitate Babylonica. Whether Castro was aware of this misleading decontextualization is difficult to determine. At any rate, he utilized the quotation to prove that the heretics were convinced that the only existing sin was incredulitas, or the lack of faith. In the next 3 quotations, things get even more complicated. Castro combines three statements to make Luther's doctrine of sola gratia sound even more ridiculous. Shortly after, Castro drew a conclusion that seemed inevitable for him and for most contemporary controversialists. Quote, although someone may commit many sins, many outrages and crimes, if his faith is firm and fixed, he will always be certain of his salvation. Unquote. For Castro, Luther would tolerate even the most severe crimes provided the perpetrators possessed faith in the sense of fiducia. However, this assumption fundamentally misses the point of Luther's theology. Nevertheless, the theologians at the Council of Trent were firmly convinced that this was indeed the position of Luther and the reformers. Castro provided a reference for each of the three statements: a sermo contra caro stadium, de captivitate babylonica, and de votis monasticis. However, none of these citations is entirely accurate. The first was actually taken from the collection of 404 Lutheran articles by Johannes Eck. The second quotation is a combination of two passages, the first of which was clearly taken from Ambrosius Catharinus, the second from Andres de Vega. The third quotation closely resembles both Cliftover's Anti-Lutherus and Eck's 404 articles. Because the wording differs in numerous details from Luther's original text, it is certain that Castro did not quote Luther directly in this passage. The situation becomes even more complex regarding the first reference, sermo contra caro stadium. While it appears to be a valid bibliographical information, no such sermo contra caro stadium actually exists. The quote originated instead from Luther's responsio against Ambrosius Catharinus. The distorted title, Sermo contra caro stadium, resulted from a very complex multi-stage copy and paste process, which was reconstructed in a groundbreaking 1976 paper by the German theologian Vincent Schnür. This chain of transmission began with Johannes Eck, who took the passage directly from Luther. Albert Picke then borrowed it from Eck, but perhaps his printer misinterpreted Eck's description Luther contra Catharinum and changed it to adversus caro stadium. Subsequently, Ambrosius Catharinus and Andres de Vega copied the passage, adopting Picke's wording as sermo contra caro stadium. This is where Castro entered the stage and copied the passage yet again along with the distorted title. This very complex chain of transmission illustrates two things. On the one hand, that these theologians were clearly not reading Luther in the original, and on the other hand, that the theologians at Trent were operating with a shared pool of, so to speak, pre-packaged errors. A remark of Ambrosius Catharinus reflects this last aspect. Catharinus complained that, quote, the Spaniard Alfonso de Castro has inserted many of Cardinal Cayetan's errors, previously noted by me, into his catalogue of heresies. And Albert Picke copied even more, without even mentioning my name, as Catharinus complained. So this was a common problem, so to speak, in this group of theologians at the Council of Trent. Although this phenomenon of chains of indirect citations holds true for Luther, it would be a mistake to generalize. In the post-Tridentine revisions of Adversus Omnis Haereses, we find a growing number of direct citations of other reformers. For the two quotations on this slide, the exact same wording can be found in Bucer's works. Martin Bucer, a famous Protestant reformer in Strasbourg. However, Domingo de Soto cited the very same quotations in the same order on the single page. And if we follow the idea of a shared pool of packaged errors, Castro may have copied both quotations from Soto's famous book. However, an overview of all the quotations in the article on Gratia reveals that at least 5 out of 14 seem to be taken directly from Protestant books, while Luther is mainly quoted indirectly. Nearly all of the direct quotations refer to other reformers like Melanchthon, Spangenberg, and so on. In order to generalize these findings, I went beyond the article Gratia and used the same method to analyze the quotations in the Lemmata Absolutio, Fides, and Sacerdotium. Although the sources of 5 quotations are still unknown, I can definitely say that Castro took nearly 60% of the 39 quotations I analyzed, either from Catholic controversialists or from the list of errors in Ex Urge Domine. Only 1/3 or less was taken directly from Protestant books. Consequently, Castro's perspective was filtered through the lens of anti-Lutheran controversialists, mainly German controversialists, by the way, particularly the list of errors from the list of errors that were written during the 1520s. It was only in the final revision of his catalogue that Castro incorporated additional quotations from foundational Protestant works, such as Melanchthon's Loci Theologici or the Margarita Theologica of Spangenberg. In summary, Alfonso de Castro's Adversus Omnes Haeresis is less a direct engagement with Protestant primary sources and more a sophisticated synthesis of a shared Catholic polemical memory. Despite the claims of examining countless volumes, nearly 60% of the citations I analyzed were drawn from existing Catholic compendia like those of Johannes Eck, Johannes Cochlaeus, and so on. The Council of Trent seems to serve as a critical junction. While Diego de Mendoza's library finally provided access to original Protestant works, Castro primarily used them to reinforce an already solidified image of heresy that he put forward with his catalog of heresies. Castro did not read Luther to understand him, but to categorize him from the standpoint of Spanish scholasticism of the time. By isolating phrases in rigore ut jacent, as they lie, as they are written, he constructed a rigid system of Lutheranism that fit into his own scholastic framework, even when it fundamentally hid Luther's theological intent. Castro's work reflects a dense European network of anti-Lutheran intertextuality, where decontextualized errors of the heretics were pre-packaged and passed between the authors. Adversus Omnes Haeresis served as a vital node in this network. On the one hand, it drew extensively from earlier compendia of heresies. On the other hand, it profoundly influenced the Council Fathers at Trent, as well as generations of theologians and book censors in the decades that follow. In conclusion, we see that the shaping of Castro's perspective was not a matter of direct encounter with the Reformation or with the Protestant theologians, but rather a process of scholastic molding based on a shared polemical heritage, so to speak. Ultimately, his Lutheranism tells us less about what Luther actually wrote or thought, and more about how the defenders of orthodoxy constructed the image of their enemy. Thank you very much for your attention.